Chapter 1 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole Bollman. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Mistress Spring. Oh, very soon, sweet Mistress Spring will come upon the earth, and all the trees will bud with leaves, and flowers deck the earth, and Mr. Merry Sun will shine from out the blue, blue sky. The sunny meadow will be seen, dressed up in velvet, soft and green, and from the shady forest heard the happy song of mating bird. "Ha ha!" shouted Little Jack Rabbit. "Spring will soon be here," and he gave a hop, skip, and jump out of the bramble patch. And pretty soon, not so very far, he met old Professor Jim Crow with his little wisdom book under his wing. "Good morning," said the little rabbit. "Good morning," answered the wise old bird as he put on his spectacles. "Listen, and I will read you something from my little wisdom book. When winter uncovers his blanket of snow, you will see where the first little spring flowers grow." And then Professor Jim Crow flapped his wings and flew away. And after that, the little rabbit looked all around to find the little spring flowers. And then all of a sudden, he heard a bluebird say, "Look in the shady forest. There the flowers bloom early in the spring, or not at all. For when the trees are covered with leaves, the forest is so shady that the flowers cannot find the sunshine." "How much you know?" said the little rabbit. "Professor Crow didn't tell me that." And then he hopped away, not the old crow, you know, but the little rabbit, as fast as he could to the shady forest. And pretty soon he saw a little primrose, and then a lily, and after that a crocus. "Ha ha!" said the little rabbit. "Spring is here." And then Bobby Redvest sang a song, and the sweet-voiced bluebird, and pretty soon Chippy Chipmunk came out of his winter home under the roots of the chestnut tree. "Hello, Little Jack Rabbit. Winter has gone, I hope." And then the little chipmunk stretched himself, and after that he ran along the top rail of the old rail fence, just to try out his legs, you see. "Goodness me," said Little Jack Rabbit. "I mustn't wait another minute. I want to see all my friends who have slept through the winter." So he hopped away, and pretty soon, not so very long, he saw Busy Beaver sitting on a log in the forest pool. "Spring is here!" shouted Little Jack Rabbit. "Guess you're right," said Busy Beaver as he dived into the water. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole Bollman. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Polly Parrot. No sooner had Busy Beaver disappeared in the forest pool than along came the big brown bear. He had just been down to the 3-1-cent store to buy a new fur overcoat. He certainly needed it after sleeping all winter in his old one. The little rabbit told him it was very becoming, for it fitted him like the paper on the wall in our nursery, where roses grow on pretty green vines and little white lambs play beside a winding brook that flows down to the big blue ocean. Well, as soon as the big brown bear had looked at himself in the bubbling brook, Little Jack Rabbit started off through the shady forest, clipperty-clip, lipperty-lip, until he came to a fallen tree which Mr. North Wind had blown down just before Christmas Day. And who do you suppose was sitting on it? You'll never guess, even if I give you until the next story. So I'll tell you right away. Why, it was a green parrot. And she was crying all by herself and saying, "I'm so unhappy, I can't think. My feathers are all turning pink. They used to be as green as grass, but now they're pink. Alas, alas." "Never mind," said Little Jack Rabbit. "Why don't you go down to the 3-1-cent store and buy some new feathers? I saw some lovely green ones there." And this rather cheered up the miserable Polly Parrot, and she started off for Rabbitville at once. And maybe she got some green feathers, for I think they had some left over from St. Patrick's Day. Well, as soon as she was gone, the little rabbit hopped along, and as he passed under a little bush, he heard a voice say, "I'm just a little crawly bug. My cousin's a tiny slug. My uncle is a lazy snail who carries his house upon his tail." "Ha ha!" laughed the little bunny. "Now I know who you are. You're a rosebug. But you'll have to wait until Miss South Wind brings the wild roses. But she will, never fear." And then he hopped away, for he just couldn't stand still this lovely spring day, for everything was awakening. The sap was running up the tree trunks, and the little buds were turning into leaves on the twigs. The ferns were putting on their green lace dresses, and the toadstools rising their umbrella tops to keep their feet dry when the clouds dropped the rain down from the high gray sky. All the earth smelled damp and fresh, and the forest was turning a tender green, and the feathered folk were gathering little pieces of moss and twigs with which to build nests for their pretty colored eggs. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kishan. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Barnyard Friends. Miss Springtime Wind is playing tag with crocus bud and yellow flag, and down the bubbling brook she skips, and hides behind the gold cow slips. And then across the meadow gay, she lifts her skirt and runs away. And after her went Little Jack Rabbit, clipperty-clip, lipperty-lip, until he lost her in the woods, where she hid behind Professor Jim Crow and tickled his ear. Well, pretty soon, the little rabbit came to the old farmyard, where Cocky Doodle strutted about with his gold-tailed feathers shining in the bright rays of Mr. Merry Sun. "Cock-a-doodle-doo," said the friendly rooster, and the little rabbit wiggled his pink nose and kicked out his hind feet, and then he said, "Pretty well, thank you. How are you?" And the weathercock on the big red barn turned around on his toe and began to crow, for Billy Brize made him go wherever he wanted him to, you know. "Where's Henny Penny?" asked Little Jack Rabbit, and he looked behind the barn and under the corn crib, but the little hen wasn't there. "No sirree, ma'am and Mr. Farmer." Of course she wasn't. She was sitting in her nest on 13 white eggs, which pretty soon would break open and hatch 13 little yellow chicks. That is, if Mr. Wicked Weasel doesn't get into the hen house and steal them before the kind farmer closes the door. Pretty soon Turkey Tim strutted around from behind the big haystack and, spreading his tail like a Japanese fan, said "Gobble, gobble, gobble," and after that he picked up 2 kernels of corn that Ducky Waddles had forgotten to eat. All of a sudden, old Sickum, the farmer's dog, spied the little rabbit, and oh dear me, how that old dog did bark, and this brought the farmer to the kitchen door, and when he saw the little rabbit, he called to his wife, "Say, marm, here's Little Jack Rabbit." And the farmer's wife stopped cutting the bread with the carving knife and came to the door, while old Sickum scratched his ear with his paw. But Little Jack Rabbit wasn't so sure but what the farmer might take down his old shotgun from behind the door, so away he hopped to the shady forest. And when he got there, who do you suppose were waiting for him? Why, Old Squirrel Nutcracker and Chippy Chipmunk. "We knew you weren't very far away," said the old squirrel, "for Miss Springtime Wind told us you were near." And the way she told him was by carrying the scent of the little rabbit to the old squirrel's nose. That's how the little 4-footed folk find out lots of things, for they don't have any radiophone, you see. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kishan. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. The Wisdom Book. Professor Jim Crow, with his little wisdom book, sat on a tree in a quiet shady nook, and turned to page number 1, 2, 3, and cawed 3 times, and then he said B, "If you'll only stop to listen while I read my little book, at the big dictionary you'll never have to look. So give especial heed while my little book I read, and stop your splashing pebbles in the little bubbling brook. And then Little Jack Rabbit sat down on a toadstool and wiggled his little pink nose this way and that way until the old crow professor said, "Stop, stop, you make me dizzy." Just then, a little garter snake crawled from his house and stuck out his tongue. "Gracious me!" cawed the crow professor. "Worse and worse!" And he turned over to page 23 and began to smile. "I'm not sticking my tongue out at you," said the little garter snake. "I know that," said Professor Jim Crow, and he took off his spectacles and wiped them on the leaf. And then he read aloud, "A snake uses his tongue in the same way that an animal uses his ears. His tongue is very sensitive and can feel things in the air as well as taste food. He hears with his tongue, for he has no ears." "That's right," cried the little garter snake. "If I kept my tongue in my mouth, I'd never hear anything." "Ha ha," laughed Little Jack Rabbit. "I can smell danger before I can hear it." And the little rabbit wiggled his nose 3 times and a half to find out if Danny Fox were near, or maybe Mr. Wicked Weasel. But they weren't, for Billy Breeze would have carried their smell to the little bunny, you may be sure, for he liked the little bunny and always warned him of danger. "What you both say is in my little wisdom book," said Professor Jim Crow, "and lots of other wise things, which I haven't time to read to you now." And off he flew to his house in the shady forest. After that, the little rabbit said goodbye to the garter snake and hopped away, and by he came to a river, in the bank of which Mr. Kingfisher had his home. But the little rabbit didn't go in, no sirree, for the hallway was a tunnel 5 or 6 feet long, leading to a room made of sticks, bark, fish bones, and grass. It wasn't a very nice sort of nest, but Mrs. Kingfisher liked it, and so did the little Kingfishers. Just as Little Jack Rabbit was going to knock on the front door, Mr. Kingfisher dived headfirst into the river with a great splash, and after a struggle rose with a silvery perch in his great bill. But oh dear me! That fish wiggled so hard that Mr. Kingfisher was obliged to hit its head against the limb of a tree before he could carry it home to his nest in the river bank. "Now let me see," said Little Jack Rabbit to himself. "I think I'll stop on the way home at the tall pine tree. Maybe Professor Jim Crow will teach me some more things." Then away he hopped to the shady forest. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kishan. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Kindly Seeds. In less than 500 short seconds from the moment Little Jack Rabbit hopped out of the last story into this one, he came to the tall pine tree house where Professor Jim Crow lived. "Back again?" cawed the wise old bird. "Listen to this poetry in my little wisdom book." So the little rabbit sat up on his hind legs and wiggled his nose 3 times and a half, and when he had finished, the old blackbird had on his spectacles and was ready to commence. "In the spring the wild birds sing, the flowers nod and smile, the bubbling brook, with twist and crook, flows on for many a mile. The farmer plows his fields again to raise potatoes, beans, and grain." "I know that," said the little rabbit. "I saw him do it last year." "Wait a minute," said Professor Jim Crow. "I haven't finished." And then he began again. "And every little girl and boy should while each day the time employ, and sow some kindly little seed, or help a friendless one in need. You see," said the wise old crow, as he closed his little wisdom book, "everybody must do something in this great busy world. He mustn't sit still and let the bubbling brook turn the old mill wheel and the farmer plow the fields. Oh, my no. Everybody must do something to help." "That's what Mother says," laughed the little rabbit. "I polish the front doorknob every day, and feed the canary, and keep the wood box in the kitchen full of wood. And Mother says, after I've done that, I can have the rest of the day to myself." "Well, I'm glad you are doing your part," said Professor Jim Crow, putting his spectacles away in the case. "If you always do what your mother says, you won't go wrong." And then that wise old bird put them on again to see what Squirrel Nutcracker was doing. And what do you suppose he was up to? Well, you'll never guess, not if I gave you until 4th of July, so I'll tell you right away. He was cracking a last year's nut, for of course the old chestnut tree didn't have any nuts on it yet. Oh my, no, it wouldn't have any nuts until the autumn. "How did you know enough to store away nuts?" asked the little rabbit. "Ha!" laughed Squirrel Nutcracker. "A feller who can't take care of himself in this world might just as well try to borrow $1 from his mother-in-law. I don't sit still and wait for somebody to hand me a nut. No sirree, I get 'em for myself. And I didn't learn that from the wisdom book either." And after that, Squirrel Nutcracker ran up the tree to ask Mrs. Nutcracker if she felt any better, for she had lost her vanity bag and was feeling very ill over it. End of Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ella Jasmine. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Mr. Grizzly Bear. Gracious me, thought Little Jack Rabbit. I hope Professor Jim Crow didn't hear what Squirrel Nutcracker just said. And he looked anxiously up at the nice old blackbird. "Won't you read another poem?" asked the tender-hearted little rabbit. Wasn't that nice? For maybe the kind professor had heard the old squirrel's disagreeable remark. Then Professor Jim Crow took his wisdom book and said to the little bunny, "Now listen, my dear, and you shall hear something deliciously funny." And as soon as that wise old blackbird had turned to page 23, he read, "Early to bed and early to rise will help little birdies to catch worms and flies." "Ha ha!" cried the little rabbit. "What does your little book say about me?" "Rabbits should keep away from the rocks on the hill near the den of old Danny Fox," read Professor Jim Crow, glancing over page 49.5. And then that wise old bird shut his book and flew away. And so did the little rabbit. I beg your pardon, I mean hopped away. And by he came to a place where lived a great big grizzly bear. But Little Jack Rabbit didn't know this. No sirree. If he had, he never would have come there, let me tell you. For if a grizzly bear once sees you, he will chase you till he catches you. Well, all of a sudden there sounded a deep grisly growl, and out of his house came Mr. Grizzly Bear. And oh dear me, he was dreadfully big and ferocious. Why, he was big enough and strong enough to carry off a buffalo, which he sometimes does, you know, and he often digs a big pit in which to bury the buffalo, so that no other animal can get it until he is ready to finish eating it. "What are you doing in my front yard?" asked the big grizzly bear, and he scowled dreadfully at the little rabbit. "Oh, please, Mr. Grizzly Bear, I didn't know I was in your yard." "Didn't you really?" said the bear. "I guess there are a lot of things you need to learn." And then he showed his great long claws. "Do you know that I can move each claw separately?" And Mr. Grizzly moved his great big claw, and then the next one, until he came to the littlest claw. "No, I didn't know that," said the little rabbit, "but please forgive me for coming into your front yard, and if you'll let me go, I'll promise never to forget that you can move all your toes separately, one after the other, until you come to your pinky." "Ha ha ho ho!" laughed the big grizzly. "You're a funny little bunny. Sit down and tell me the news." "I'd rather sing you a song," said Little Jack Rabbit. "Go ahead," said Mr. Grizzly, and he took a corn silk cigar out of his pocket and smoked it. "The winter time is over, and the fields are full of clover, and the lollipops are budding on the dear old apple tree, and it won't be long, my honey, before each little bunny will be eating clover blossoms on the sunny grassy lea," sang the little rabbit in a scary sort of voice, for it's not an easy thing to sing a song to a big grizzly bear, let me tell you. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ella Jasmine. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Busy people. After Little Jack Rabbit had finished his song in the last story, he hopped along, clippity-clip, lippity-lip, until he came to the shady forest pond, where Tommy Otter lived. Now, Tommy Otter is a very good friend, and although he is a sort of water weasel, he isn't at all like Mr. Wicked Weasel, who lives on the land and eats little rabbits. Well, just as Little Jack Rabbit came up to the pond, he saw Tommy Otter sitting on the bank eating a fish. Now, you know Mr. Tommy Otter is a very dainty sort of a person. He will eat only the flakes at the back of the fish's neck, leaving the rest for other people who are not so particular. "My, what a wasteful fellow you are," said Little Jack Rabbit. "Don't you know these are hard times, and that you shouldn't waste the least bit of food?" "Never thought about it," replied Tommy Otter. "Glad you spoke to me. I'll just put the rest of this fish in the ice-box for tomorrow." And with a graceful sweep of his powerful tail, Tommy Otter disappeared under the water. So the little rabbit hopped away, and by he came across a wasp, who was building a house. And would you believe it, he was making his house out of paper. First he tore off thin, string-like pieces of decayed wood, which he mashed with his teeth into a pulp, and then he spread it in layers, and waited for it to harden into a very good kind of coarse paper. "Helloa," said the little rabbit, and then Mr. Wasp stopped working and looked around. "Don't bother me," he said. "I must finish these little paper cells before my pulp gets too hard." And he set to work again to make a lot of little paper box rooms in the side of the sandy bank. "Well, goodbye," said the little rabbit, and he hopped away, for he doesn't like Mr. Wasp very well, and neither does Mr. Bee, for this disagreeable wasp will rob a hive of honey every time he gets a chance. "Goodness me," exclaimed the little rabbit, "how busy everybody is! I must find something to do." And then, all of a sudden, he remembered that he had forgotten to polish the brass doorknob that morning. So he hurried back to the old bramble patch, and when he reached it he saw his mother on the front porch. "I forgot to shine the doorknob," said the little rabbit, and then Mrs. Bunny began to sing. "Lazy bones, where have you been? Don't you know it is a sin to leave your work for fun and play, and fritter all your time away?" End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ella Jasmine. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Old Mother Mischief. You remember in the last story how the little bunny forgot to polish the doorknob for his dear, kind mother? Well, as soon as she stopped singing her little song about lazy bunnies, the little rabbit hopped out to the woodpile, and brought in enough wood to fill the woodbox, and then he fed the canary and sprinkled the geraniums, and after that he sat down on the front doorstep, when, all of a sudden, who should come by but Grandmother Magpie. Dear me, but she was a bothersome old lady bird, and Mrs. Rabbit just hated the sight of her. "Have you heard the news?" she asked, settling herself in the big wicker rocking chair, and smiling at Mrs. Rabbit, as if she liked her better than anyone else in all the world. "No, what is it?" asked Mrs. Rabbit. "Why, Professor Jim Crow has lost his wisdom book. He's been hunting everywhere for it, but it can't be found." And old Mother Mischief tightened her bonnet strings, and looked at the little rabbit, as much as to say, "I have an idea you took it." But of course she didn't say so. But just the same, Little Jack Rabbit felt she meant it. Now, Mrs. Rabbit had never forgiven this meddlesome old blackbird, since the time, long ago, when she had told on Little Jack Rabbit, the time, you remember, when he dropped the letter in the bubbling brook. So the good Lady Rabbit looked up and said, "You don't mean you think my bunny boy has found Professor Jim Crow's wisdom book?" But before Grandmother Magpie could answer, who should come by but old Professor Jim Crow himself. And oh dear me, he certainly looked worried. His spectacles were pushed up high on his forehead, and his hair was all mussed up, and his long black bow tie was twisted under one ear, and his swallow-tail coat was all wrinkled up the back. "Haven't you found your wisdom book?" asked Grandmother Magpie. "No, ma'am," answered the old blackbird. "I have offered a reward for it, but it doesn't turn up. I don't know what I shall do." And then he sat down by Mrs. Rabbit and wiped his beak with his pocket handkerchief. "I'll go out and look for it," said Little Jack Rabbit. And before the old crow could even thank him, the little bunny hopped away, and pretty soon he came across Timmy Meadowmouse, who lived in the Sunny Meadow. "Have you seen a little wisdom book?" asked Little Jack Rabbit. But Timmy Meadowmouse only shook his head, so the little rabbit hopped on, and pretty soon, not so very far, he saw Bobby Redvest, sitting on the top rail of the old rail fence. "Have you seen a little wisdom book?" But Bobby Redvest answered no. "The only thing I've seen," he said, "is a red strawberry in the garden." End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. The Yellow Dog Tramp. Now, let me see. When we left off in the last story, Little Jack Rabbit was hunting for the wisdom book which old Professor Jim Crow had lost. Yes, that's right. And now we'll see if we can't find that little wisdom book in this story. Well, the little rabbit didn't get discouraged. He kept on, and of everybody he met, he asked the same question. "Have you seen a little wisdom book?" But old Squirrel Nutcracker hadn't, nor Chippy Chipmunk, nor Granddaddy Bullfrog. Of course, the little rabbit didn't ask Danny Fox, nor Old Man Weasel. No, sirree. He kept away from those two old robbers, let me tell you. Well, by and by, after a while and maybe a mile, he met his old friend, the Yellow Dog Tramp. "He's the very one to ask," thought the little rabbit. "He's tramping all day, and maybe he's found it." "Halloa!" said the friendly tramp dog. "Halloa!" answered the little rabbit. "Have you seen a little wisdom book?" "Is this it?" asked the Yellow Dog Tramp, and he took out of the pocket of his old tattered coat a small black book. "That's it!" shouted the little rabbit. "It belongs to Professor Jim Crow. He's lost it." "Well, you can give it to him," said the good-natured tramp dog. "I was reading it a while ago when I sat down to rest, but if it belongs to him, I don't want it." And he handed it to the little rabbit. "Thank you. Goodbye." And away hopped the little bunny to the old bramble patch. But, oh dear me, before he got there something happened. Wasn't that too bad? Yes, sir, just as he hopped through the old rail fence, Danny Fox jumped up from behind a rock. "Ha ha, hee hee," said that wicked old robber. "Now I'll have a feast." And he was just going to grab the little rabbit when, all of a sudden, the miller's boy shot off his gun and Mr. Danny felt a stinging pain, and away he went after that on 3 legs for his den on the hillside, where Mrs. Fox put a poultice on to draw out the bullet. And what do you think the little bunny was doing all this time? I guess you know, but I'll tell you anyway. He was hopping as fast as he could toward the old bramble patch, and before the miller's boy could reload his gun, for it was an old-fashioned one, you know, and belonged to his great-grandfather when he was a boy, the little rabbit was safe at home. "Here's your little book," he said to Professor Jim Crow, who you remember was making a call on Mrs. Rabbit in the last story. And that old crow was so delighted to get his book back that he gave the little bunny a cough drop. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 10 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by valroth. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Chapter 10. The Little Freshwater Crab. You remember in the last story that Little Jack Rabbit had found Professor Jim Crow's wisdom book. And wasn't that old bird delighted? Well, I just guess he was. And he kept on thanking the little rabbit until the little bunny thought he'd never stop. So at last he said, "Won't you read something out of your book, Professor?" And then that wise old bird put on his spectacles and turned to page 23 and commenced. "He who fights and hops away will live to hop another day." And then the old crow shut his book with a snap and flew away. But before he went, he gave the little bunny another cough drop. Then the little rabbit threw his knapsack over his shoulder and, picking up a striped candy cane, started out over the sunny meadow. And by he came to the bubbling brook where his friend the little fresh water crab lived. "Hello, little bunny," he said, for he was so busy eating watercress that he didn't want to stop. "Come on, I'll race you down to the old duck pond," said Little Jack Rabbit. "Wait till I've finished this watercress." "No, I won't," replied the little bunny. "Come now or never." So the little fresh water crab started down the bubbling brook as fast as he could swim, and the little rabbit along the edge of the bank as fast as he could hop. And although the bubbling brook pushed the little crab along, and Billy Brize the little rabbit, I can't tell you who would have won. For all of a sudden the big claw of the little crab caught fast in a net which the miller's boy had spread across the stream. And the little rabbit kept on hopping, for he didn't know what had happened, you see, and pretty soon he came to the old duck pond, where Granddaddy Frog sat on his log all day and swallowed the flies in a solemn way, and patted his waistcoat up and down, and blinked his eyes like a circus clown. "Why, where is my little crab friend?" asked the little rabbit, and he looked up the bubbling brook, and when he saw what had happened, he hopped over to the next page to hear how the little crab got out of the net. Oh, a net is a cruel, cruel thing. It holds you tight with each little string, and there you stay till the fisherman throws you into his big tin can. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by valroth. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Chapter 11. Rabbitville P.O. Now I suppose you have been worried to death about the little freshwater crab that got caught in the net, as I mentioned in the story before this. And you may be sure he was worried too, for he didn't know how soon the farmer's boy might come along and find him. So he tugged and pulled, but his big claw wouldn't let go. Wasn't that funny? I guess the little crab was so excited he didn't know how to open it. Well, pretty soon Little Jack Rabbit hopped back from the old duck pond to find out what had become of the little crab. And as soon as he saw him fast in the net, he set out for the farmyard to borrow Henny Penny's scissors. "I'll come with you," said the kind-hearted little hen, and she put her new spring bonnet on her bright red comb and ran down to the bubbling brook. And then she opened her little work bag and took out her scissors, and in less time than I can take to tell you it, she cut the fish net all around the little crab's claws until he was free. But oh dear me, there was a big hole in the net.
"I'll thread my needle and sew it together,"
said the little hen. "No, let the little fishes swim right through it so the miller's boy can't take them home to fry for breakfast," said kind-hearted Little Jack Rabbit. Then the little freshwater crab swam down to the old duck pond, where there wasn't any net to catch him, and told Granddaddy Bullfrog all about his narrow escape. And after that the little rabbit hopped down to the post office at Rabbitville to see if there was a letter for him. And when he got there, he found that his dear uncle, Mr. John Hare, the old gentleman rabbit, you know, had just received a letter from Uncle Sam's head gardener. The envelope was big and fat and full of seeds, lollipop and watermelon seeds, and every kind of seed you could think of. "Hop into the bunnymobile," said the old gentleman rabbit, "and we'll go back to my house, for I want to start my garden right away." So off they went, and on the way they stopped to get the old red rooster to scratch up the earth and plant the seeds. Well, he was at home all right, sitting on his front doorstep, smoking a corncob pipe and crowing every once in a while just to make other roosters jealous, for he could crow louder than anyone in Chicken Town. In a few minutes he was ready to go with the two little rabbits, and by, not so very far, they all arrived at Uncle John Hare's house in Turnip City, USA. End of Chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Robert Cheyne. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Try again. The next morning, while the two little rabbits and the old red rooster were out in the garden, who should come by but Professor Jim Crow with his little wisdom book under his wing. "Wait a minute, please," he shouted. Then, after putting on his spectacles and cawing 3 times, he turned to page 23. "If at first you don't succeed, and your flower is a weed, till the soil and plant again, trusting to the sun and rain." "What does it mean?" asked the little rabbit, and he wiggled his little pink nose, for he was perplexed, which means he didn't understand, you know. And then Professor Jim Crow took off his spectacles and wiped them on a little blade of dry grass. "I'll explain," he said, and he stroked his beak and looked very wise. "It means that if at first you can't do what you set out to do, to try all over again without losing faith in yourself and the goodness of things." And then the wise old crow closed his little black book and put it in his swallowtail pocket and flew away. And after him went the little rabbit, with 2 hops to the right and 3 to the left, and I don't know how many in front of him, for he was out of the garden before I had time to count them. And by, not so very far, he came to a place where the grass was very green, for a little spring of water bubbled right out of the ground, and the moisture made the ferns and violets come out early in the spring. "Ah," said the little rabbit to himself, "now I know where the bubbling brook starts from." For a little stream of water flowed away through the shady forest, in and out among the trees until it fell splashety-splash over some rocks and wound through the sunny meadow till it reached the big blue ocean, where the mermaids combed their hair all day, and the porpoises played in the foamy spray, and the little fishes and the great big whales chased the ships with their snow-white sails. So he sat down and looked about him, when all of a sudden, just like that, he heard a great crashing noise, and the first thing he knew, the big brown bear said, "Here I am, little rabbit." But, oh dear me, wasn't his fur overcoat moth-eaten? I guess Mrs. Bear had forgotten to put it up in camphor balls for the winter. Wasn't that too bad? But, you see, he had slept through all the cold winter months and had never taken it off, which was very careless of him, especially when there had been a sale of lovely pink pajamas at the 3-1-cent store on the corner of Lettuce Avenue and Turnip Street, Rabbitville, USA, just before Thanksgiving. And if he doesn't buy a new coat for summer, I shan't let him get any honey from Mrs. Busy Bee, who lives in a little brown hive. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Water Lilies. Now let me think what happened after the big brown bear said, "Here I am." Oh, of course. Little Jack Rabbit answered, "Sorry, but I can't wait. I must follow the bubbling brook. That's the way Professor Crow went." By and by the little bunny came to the weeping willow tree that grew near the old mill where Granddaddy Bullfrog fished every day from his log, and Teddy Turtle lived in his little shell house that he always carried around on his back and for which he never had to pay rent, and where the big blue darning needle darted here and there over the water like an aeroplane. Well, as the little rabbit looked about him, he saw some lovely water lily buds. "I wish I could take them home to Mother," he thought. "Listen, little rabbit, and I will read you something about water lilies," said Professor Jim Crow, who had perched in the weeping willow tree. Then that wise old bird turned to page 23 of his little wisdom book. "Water lilies have the habit of opening day after day 3 times, and then their little life is over. If their long stalks are cut away, we can keep them afloat in a shallow dish, opening for 3 days and shutting at night for sleep." "Oh, how I wish I could take some home to Mother," said the little rabbit again. "Why don't you ask Teddy Turtle to bring some to you?" said the wise old blackbird as he folded his little book under his wing and wiped his spectacles with a nice clean leaf. So the little rabbit called out, Teddy Turtle, please come here." And in less than 500 short seconds, Teddy Turtle, with his little shell house on his back, swam up to the bank to ask what was the matter. "I want some lily buds to take home to Mother," answered the little rabbit. "All right," replied Teddy Turtle. "I'll get you some." And off he went, and pretty soon he came back with 3 pretty buds for the little bunny. "Wait a minute before you hop away," said the kind weeping willow tree. "I will sing you a little song about water lilies." And then Billy Breeze blew a soft whistling kind of music, and the weeping willow tree began. "The water lilies every night their pretty flowers close up tight, and every morning for 3 days they open to the sun's warm rays. They're very good to go to sleep when evening shadows start to creep, but when is past the quiet night, they open with the morning light. And that's the way all children should, who wish to grow up strong and good." As soon as little Jack Rabbit reached the old bramble patch, he gave the lily buds to his mother, who put them in a shallow dish of water, and that night they closed up tight. But when morning came, and Billy Brize sang through the open window, and Mr. Merry Sun climbed up the big blue sky, they opened their eyes, and maybe they smiled at Mrs. Rabbit as she cooked the breakfast. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Mrs. Cow. It was a mighty nice breakfast which Mrs. Rabbit was getting in the last story, let me tell you. Stewed lollipops and carrot tea. And what is more delicious, I should like to know. And so would a famous French chef I once met. Well, as soon as the little bunny had finished, he fed the canary and polished the front doorknob, and then out he hopped on the sunny meadow. There was no one in sight. I guess Timmy Meadow Mouse was still asleep in his little grass-woven house. Maybe he didn't own a sing-song alarm clock. One which sang in the early morning, get up, it's time to rise. A soft pink glow is on the skies. The morning glories are awake. The lily buds on Silver Lake have opened wide their golden hearts, and Mrs. Darning Needle darts above the water here and there to sew up every rip and tear. Just then along came Mrs. Cow, ringing the little bell on her leather collar. Tinkle, tinkle, little bell, down the meadow past the dell, Mrs. Cow is on her way to the cowshed old and gray, where the farmer, Mr. Toole, will milk her on a three-legged stool, shouted Professor Jim Crow from his little wisdom book as he sat in the apple tree at the corner of the old rail fence. And then the old crow looked up over his spectacles to see if Mrs. Cow had heard it too, but I guess she hadn't, although there she stood, whisking the flies with her tail. "What were you reading out of your little wisdom book?" she asked, walking over to the tree to rub her head up and down on the trunk. But oh dear me, no sooner had Professor Jim Crow read the poetry over again than Mrs. Cow began to laugh, for the farmer who owned her wasn't Mr. Toole. "What are you laughing at?" asked the old crow angrily. And when Mrs. Cow explained, all he could say was, "Well, what is the farmer's name? I want my little wisdom book to be right, you know. Maybe I'll ask him to change his name to Mr. Toole." "He'll never do that," said Mrs. Cow. "Goodness me, what shall I do then?" asked the old crow, and he looked very mournful, for he was very proud of his little wisdom book, let me tell you, and this was the first time he had found a mistake in it. "You'd better change the poetry," said Mrs. Cow. "My farmer's name is White." So the old professor put on his spectacles and took out his fountain pen, and by, after a while, he said, "Listen to me. I've changed the last two lines to read, 'Where the farmer, Mr. White, milks her every morn and night.'" And then Little Jack Rabbit, who hadn't said a word all this time, took a lollipop out of his knapsack and told Mrs. Cow to give it to the weathercock on the big red barn. Oh, lollipops are pink and blue and sometimes green and yellow too, but weathercocks don't care a mite if they are only sugar white. End of Chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. The Railroad Crossing. After Little Jack Rabbit had hopped along for maybe 1,000,000 hops, skips, and jumps, he came to the railroad. And who do you suppose was waving a red flag? Why, the old red rooster. Yes, there he stood on the railroad crossing, waving a red flag. "Wait a minute," he called out. "The Rabbitville Express is coming." And then all of a sudden the train came rushing by, the whistle blew and the bell rang, and the smoke came out of the smokestack, and the little rabbit could hardly see through the dust that blew past him. "Come into my house," said the old red rooster, and he led the way into a hut that stood close to the railroad crossing. All of a sudden the telephone rang, so the old red rooster took down the receiver. "Helloa, cock-a-doodle-doo. Tell me first if you are you. The 10:15 has just gone by. She's going fast as apple pie. At 12:15 the next train's due. Goodbye, cock-a-doodle-doo." And then he hung up and turned to the little rabbit. "I've got lots of time on this job. You see, the trains run about every 2 hours, so between times I can do most any old thing." And then he showed the little rabbit the pictures on the wall. You see, this old red rooster had cut out all the pretty pictures on the magazine covers and had pasted them all around the walls of his wooden house. And at one end he had a picture of Uncle Sam, and all around it pictures of soldier boys and sailor boys, and in another place he had a picture of Aunt Columbia, and all around it were pictures of soldier girls and Red Cross nurses. And oh dear me, Little Jack Rabbit thought it the prettiest little house he'd ever seen. In one corner was a little iron stove to keep the place warm in the winter-time, and in another corner there was a little table and chair and a bunk with a mattress and a pillow besides. Well, just then a big white goose came up to the door and said she wanted a ticket to Goose Creek. "I don't sell tickets," said the old red rooster. "I'm the flagman at the crossing. I keep people from getting in the way of the trains." "I don't want to get in the way of a train," said Mrs. Goose. "I want to get on the train." "You'll have to go down to the station then," said the old red rooster. "I don't sell tickets and the train don't stop here." So Mrs. Goose waddled off to get her ticket for Goose Creek. And I don't believe she'd gone for more than 500 short seconds when a little pig dressed in a blue shirt and an old pair of pants looked into the doorway. "I want a ticket to Piggyville." "Go down to the station and get your ticket," said the old red rooster. "I don't sell tickets. I'm the flagman at the crossing and keep little pigs from getting in the way of trains." So the little pig ran out to get his ticket to Piggyville. And by, after a little while, not so very long, up came a little dog. He carried a little bag in his mouth and was in a great hurry. "I want a ticket to Towser City." "You'll have to go down to the station. I don't sell tickets. I'm the flagman who keeps little dogs from getting run over," answered the old red rooster. End of story.
Chapter 16 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Winnifred Assmann. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Madam Mason Wasp. You remember the story before this was about Old Red Rooster, who was flagman at the railroad crossing. Well, after the little dog who wanted to buy a ticket had trotted away, the Old Red Rooster turned to the little rabbit and said, "The next train will be coming by in 500 short seconds. I must get my red flag." and he stepped out of his wooden house and stood in the road and waved his flag up and down and maybe sideways, and pretty soon along came the train on its iron road, whiz-bang. "Goodbye," shouted Little Jack Rabbit, and off he hopped, for he didn't want to be all covered with dust, for every time the train went by that crossing, great clouds of dust blew this way and that, and Little Jack Rabbit didn't want his little brown fur suit all dirty, you know. Well, after a while, and maybe a mile, and maybe a smile or two, he came to a place that was green and cool, and the grass all covered with dew. Oh, dear me! Why didn't my typewriter make a nice little verse out of this rhyme, I should like to know? "Hello!" All of a sudden, just like that, called out a voice. So the little rabbit looked all around, under a stone and behind a bush, but he couldn't see anything. Not even a wing or a tail, or a war-saving stamp. "Who are you?" asked the little rabbit. "I'm a wasp," replied the voice. "Come over and see what I'm doing." "But where are you?" asked the little rabbit, for he couldn't see her, you know. "I'm here on the windowsill of this little log hut," replied Madam Mason Wasp, for that was her full name. So the little rabbit hopped over to the log hut, and there on a windowsill he saw Madam Wasp near a wooden spool. "This little wooden thing will make me a nice nest," she said when the little bunny was close enough to see what she was doing. "See how nicely my body fits into the little hole." And then in she went to try it, and then out, tail first. "I couldn't dig a more comfortable hole in a sandbank for my eggs, and I shall be saved all the trouble of digging hour after hour. I can bring my bricks here and build my house." Little Jack Rabbit didn't answer. He just stood there and watched her, for he was curious to know how she was going to carry those big bricks. "I don't suppose you ever saw a wasp build her house, did you?" she asked. "Well, you just follow me." And off she flew to a sandbank near by, and when she got there she picked up with her nimble little feet the loose grains of sand and glued them together with her wet little tongue into round balls as large as mustard seeds. And in the next story, if you'll promise to buy something for a little sick boy, I'll tell you how she made her little house. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Winnifred Assmann. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Mr. Tent Maker Caterpillar. You remember, in the last story, Mrs. Mason Wasp was making bricks out of sand, don't you? And that little Jack Rabbit was watching her roll the loose grains into little balls about as large as mustard seeds. Well, no sooner had she made one little ball by wetting the sand with her tongue, till all the little grains were glued together. Then off she flew with it, to the windowsill of the little log hut, where she placed it carefully around the hole in the wooden spool. Back and forth she went to the sand pile, bringing with her each time a little sand brick, and pretty soon she had a fence all around the edge of the hole in the wooden reel of spool cotton. And after a while the little balls of sand were as high as a tower. And then she was mighty glad, for I guess she had a dreadful backache carrying all those little sand bricks. "Now I have a nice entrance," she said. "But before I lay my eggs in my little sand house, I must do something else." So off she flew, and after her went the little rabbit, for he was curious to see what she meant to do next. Well, pretty soon she came to a nettle on which a caterpillar was building his tent. But Mr. Tent Maker Caterpillar didn't see her. Oh my, no! He was too busy looking for a leaf which could be easily bent. And when he found the one he wanted, he stood still right in the middle, clinging tightly to it with his little legs near his tail, and then reaching his head forward, began spinning a number of cords, which he fastened side by side to the edge of the leaf. And after that he spun more cords and pulled until he bent the leaf over, and then he wove the top to his tent. And all this time he never saw Madam Wasp. No, he just thought he'd soon have his tent finished, and there he would live until he turned into a beautiful butterfly. But Madam Wasp didn't intend to wait until then. She crept toward him on tiptoe with her wings folded, and then, all of a sudden, just like that, she pounced on him, and taking a good hold around his fat waist, flew away with him to her house on the window-sill of the log hut. Then she rolled him down into her nest and wound some ropes around him so he couldn't move. "There," she said, "now my work is almost done. Tomorrow I'll lay my eggs, and when from them the little grubs are hatched, they'll have something to eat. What a nice warm nest I've made for my little ones, and what a nice lunch this fat caterpillar will make." "You are a wonderful insect," said the little rabbit. "I never knew all this before." "Oh, this isn't all," replied Madam Wasp. "When the little grubs are hatched, they will build cocoons, in which they will stay until the time comes for them to gnaw their way out, for then they will be full-grown wasps." End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Hannah Lake. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Flying Seeds. "Dear me," sighed Little Jack Rabbit as he left Mrs. Wasp. "I don't know where I'll put all these things I'm learning. My head is too small to hold everything. I wish I had a notebook and a fountain pen." But he didn't, although he hunted all through his knapsack and in his pockets and under a stone. If he had hopped over to Rabbitville, he would have found them in the 3-1-cent store, I'm sure. Why didn't he think of that? I wonder. Maybe he did, for every once in a while he took a handful of carrot cents from his pocket and counted. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. That's not enough for a fountain pen. Well, here's a lettuce leaf dollar bill. Would that buy a notebook I could fill? What is the use of things so dear? I'll try to remember all I hear. Just then he came to the old rail fence, where the flaming goldenrod peeped over the rails and nodded to him in the warm September time. And oh me, oh my, wasn't it a lovely day? The grass was still soft and green, and a delicious odor of ripe apples came from the orchard on the hillside. "Where are you going?" asked the little rabbit as a maple seed came flying down the wind. "You fly just like a bird." "Not as well as a bird," said the maple seed, "but I'm glad I can fly, for then I can go where I please." "But where are you going?" asked the little rabbit again, for he was a curious little bunny, let me tell you. But that's the way to be if you wish to learn things. "Oh, I'm hunting for a nice little spot to hide in until spring comes again. There I will grow until someday I'm a big maple tree." "Will you have to wait all through the long winter?" asked the little rabbit. "Yes," said the little maple seed. "But when the spring comes, I will send my roots down into the earth and 2 narrow green leaves up into the bright sunny air. And then I'll just keep on growing and growing until I'm a maple tree." "Oh, how I wish Professor Jim Crow were here," said the little rabbit. "He would love to put all you've told me in his little wisdom book." And would you believe it? Just then, all of a sudden, up flew the old crow himself. "Please tell him what you've just told me," begged Little Jack Rabbit of Maple Seed. And then Professor Jim Crow got out his fountain pen and opened his little wisdom book. And pretty soon he had filled 2 pages. "There," exclaimed that wise old bird, "I've learned something today, and I've got it in my little wisdom book for safekeeping in case my old head forgets it." Then he took off his great big spectacles and winked his left eye. for he had discovered something new about maple trees. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by KerrySL. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by Cory. The Antlion.
"Goodness me," said Little Jack Rabbit. "I can't wait for Professor Jim Crow to wink his right eye." And he hopped over to this page where he met a queer little insect that eats ants, a soft, heavy little fellow with very weak legs. But oh dear me, he had a very strong appetite and very strong jaws. It didn't take him long to dig a hole in the sand, and when it was deep enough, he buried himself at the bottom with his jaws just sticking out of the sand. "What are you going to do now?" asked Little Jack Rabbit, peeping down into the sand hole.
"Oh, I'm just waiting for my dinner to come along,"
answered the Antlion, for this is the name of this strange little insect. And sure enough, pretty soon an ant looked over the edge of the little sand hole, and oh dear me, I guess he wished he hadn't been so curious, for down he slipped, and before he could get away, out wriggled the Antlion and caught him in his strong jaws. "So that's the way you get your dinner," said Little Jack Rabbit. And I guess he felt sorry for the little ant, who was so curious to see what was in the bottom of the sand hole.
"Yes, that's the way,"
answered the Antlion.
"You see, my legs aren't strong enough to chase after insects, so this is the way I bring them to me. It's just as if you sat in your old bramble patch and waited for a carrot pie to come in through the window of your mother's little house."
laughed Little Rabbit. "I'll tell that to Mother next time she bakes." And off he hopped to learn something new. And after a while, as he hopped along, he saw a beautiful butterfly on a daisy blossom. But just as he was going to speak to her, she flew away. So he hopped after her. I guess he thought he'd catch up and make friends. "What are you trying to do, little bunny?" she said as she stopped to rest on a yellow buttercup. "I don't want to hurt you," answered the little rabbit. "I just want to get close enough to see your beautiful wings." "Are there any blue jays around here?" asked the butterfly. "I'm afraid of them." "I'm not afraid of blue jays," laughed the little bunny. "One of my best friends is Jimmy Jaybird." "Aren't you afraid of Danny Fox?" asked the pretty butterfly. "No, I'm old enough to look out for him," replied the little rabbit. "I'm only 1 day old," said the butterfly. "I came out of my cocoon only this morning." "What?" said the little rabbit, and I guess he was so surprised that he wiggled his little pink nose sideways. "Perhaps I shouldn't say that," answered the butterfly. "I'll explain in a minute." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by RosiesReading. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by Cory. Mrs. Jenny Wren. Well, all of a sudden, the pretty butterfly who was talking to our little Jack Rabbit in the story before this poked her head into the yellow part of the daisy. And this, of course, made the little bunny very curious, so he asked her what she was doing. "Why, I was just getting a drink," she answered. "But it isn't water, you know. It's honey." "But if you're only a day old and came out of your cocoon this morning, how do you know so much?"
"Well, you see," replied the pretty butterfly, "last fall I was a crawly thing called a caterpillar. But before the cold weather came, I spun a little house called a cocoon, and there I slept all winter long. And when I came out this morning, I had beautiful wings, and as soon as I saw the lovely flowers smiling on the sunny meadow, I flew from one to another. I didn't have to learn to do that, nor to drink the sweet dew. And then off flew the lovely butterfly. So the little rabbit hopped along all by himself till he saw Mrs. Jenny Wren. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm looking for some moss and hair to build my pretty nest. But if I cannot find some moss, I'll take what next is best." "What is next best?" asked the little rabbit, curiously, and I guess he wished that old Professor Jim Crow was around with his little wisdom book, so that he could write little Miss Jenny Wren's answer in it. "Oh, most anything that is warm and dry and soft," she replied, and then up flew the wise crow. "What did you say?" he asked, as he opened his little wisdom book and put on his spectacles, and after that he took out his fountain pen and waited to hear what the little wren had to say. "I was just saying," she answered, bending her pretty head and winking at the little rabbit, "that we wrens use moss for our nests. But if we can't find any, we use most any old thing that is soft and warm and dry, and then we line them with hair. But oh dear me, I haven't seen a single hair this morning. Come with me, and I'll show you where you can get all the hair you need," said that wise old blackbird, and he closed his book with a snap, and his bill too, and flew away. And pretty soon he came to a bunch of thistles. "Here is enough hair for 24 nests," he said, as he pointed to the thistles from which hung little bunches of wool which the sheep had left when they had brushed by. "Oh, I'm a very wise old bird, as most of you have no doubt heard, so anything you wish to know, just ask of old Professor Crow," sang the old blackbird in a hoarse voice. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rosie's Reading. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Mrs. Honeybee. Well, as soon as little Mrs. Jenny Wren saw the sheep's wool on the prickly thistles, she picked up a little wad in her bill and flew away. But before she went, she didn't forget to be polite and thank Professor Jim Crow. Of course, when she flew away, Little Jack Rabbit was left alone with the old Professor Bird. "I wonder where she's building her nest?" asked the little bunny. So the old Professor Bird put on his long-sighted glasses and looked after the wren, and pretty soon he said, "In that old wild cherry tree, over there by the fence, Mrs. Jenny Brown Wren, her nest will commence." Now wasn't that wonderful for an old crow to make up poetry, all of a sudden, just like that, quicker than lightning? Well, I just guess it was. But I hope just the same he is a better professor than he is a poet. "You had better write that down in your little wisdom book," said Little Jack Rabbit. But the old black crow shook his head. "My little wisdom book must be full of learning," he said. "Things about insects and animals, birds and plants." And then he flew away, back to his pine tree where he had his nest near the tip-top branches, close to the quiet sky, where he could write in his little wisdom book without being bothered with the noises of the earth. "Well, I guess I'll be hopping along," thought the little rabbit, and pretty soon, not so very far, he came to a clover field. And oh dear me, how sweet the clover smelt! And oh dear me again, and maybe some more. How sweet it tasted! And then, all of a sudden, just as he was going to eat an extra nice blossom, Mrs. Brown Honeybee began to crawl all over it, just as if she was looking for something. Maybe she thought she'd find a postage stamp curled up inside. But I guess she didn't, for when the little rabbit asked her what she had lost, she said, "I haven't lost anything. I'm gathering sweet stuff out of the clover blossom." "That's just what a pretty butterfly was doing not a little while ago," he answered. "Not a bit of it," buzzed Mrs. Honeybee. "Butterflies don't make honey. They only sip the nectar from the flowers when they are hungry. I'll sing you a little song." And Miss Bee began singing in a buzzy, droning way. "The butterfly flits all day, from flower to flower, bright and gay. And she sips their sweets, but that is all. She doesn't save anything up for the fall. But the busy bee, in her careful way, stores up the sweets for a rainy day. And the honey she makes in her little brown hive, all through the winter keeps her alive." And now if you want to hear what happened after the little bee stopped singing, you must turn to the next story, which will tell who lost a carrot scent. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rosie's Reading. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. The Missing Carrot Scent. Now, when Mrs. Brown Honeybee stopped singing in the last story, Little Jack Rabbit asked her how many bees there were in her hive. And when she answered 10,000 and maybe more, he could hardly believe it. "Goodness me," he cried. "There's only Mother and me in Old Bramble Patch, and sometimes Father, but he's away most of the time getting lettuce leaves and carrots for our storehouse." "Well, I'm sure I don't know why I've been stopped here so long," said Mrs. Brown Honeybee, all of a sudden with a loud buzz. "You're a nice little rabbit, but I must be gathering honey." So off she flew, and so did the little rabbit. Only he didn't, because he hopped. And by, after a while, he came to Rabbitville. And when he looked into the big window of the 3-1-cent store, he saw a lovely lettuce lollipop. "Oh dear me, I wonder if I have a cent," he said to himself, opening his knapsack and looking all through it. But all he could find was a carrot pie, a bottle of lemon soda, and 3 transfers. Oh dear, what shall I do? I've lost my carrot cent. I'd like to know where did it go, and how and when it went." "I'll tell you," said a low voice, and before he could see who had spoken, although he looked all around, and up in the sky, and behind a barber pole that stood near the 3-1-cent store, the voice said the same thing over again. "Please tell me who you are and where you saw my carrot scent," begged the little rabbit. Then at last the same low voice said, "Down the street just a little way. I saw it under a load of hay." So away hopped the little bunny down the street as fast as he could, and pretty soon, not so very far, he came to an immense big load of hay. "Stop, stop," he cried. And when the driver heard the little rabbit's voice, he shouted, "Whoa!" to his team of billy goats, and pulled on the reins, and then, of course, the billy goat stopped, just like that. "What's the matter?" asked the driver, who turned out to be the old dog who drove the stagecoach, you remember? "Did you see a carrot scent?" asked the little rabbit. "To be sure I did," answered the good-natured old dog, and he took the scent out of his trousers pocket. "I picked it up under my wagon." "Oh, thank you so much," said the little rabbit. "It's mine." And off he hopped back to the 3-1-cent store as fast as he could go. And if he doesn't stub his toe, I'll tell you what he bought in there, besides an apple and a pear. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. The Redcoats. Well, as soon as Little Jack Rabbit reached the 3-in-1 store with his carrot scent, which you remember the old dog stage driver had found under the load of hay in the story before this, he went up to the candy counter and bought a lovely lemon lollipop, and then out he hopped and looked up and down the street, but he didn't see anybody he knew, so he turned away to the shady forest. And when he got there, he met a little wandering wood thrush. And oh dear me, he was tired and bedraggled, for he had come from the north country. "Hello, little bird, what makes you look so forlorn?" "Don't you know? The Redcoats are coming," replied the little wood thrush. "What do you mean?" asked the little rabbit, for he didn't know what the little bird was talking about. And then all of a sudden the trees began to tremble, the sturdy oak rustled his leaves, and the lovely maple bent her branches, and the slender ash grew pale with fear. "Oh dear me, what is the matter?" thought the little rabbit, for he could hear the voice of Billy Brize, sad and low. And then all the leaves, which through the long summer days had hidden the nests of Bobby Redvest and little Towhee, and cheerful Chewink and happy Bluebird and sweet Chickadee, trembled, and some even fell to the ground. "Tell me, what is the matter?" asked Little Jack Rabbit again, and the wood thrush replied, "All the trees will soon have new suits of clothes, yellow and brown and spotted, all kinds of wonderful colors, but mostly red. The redcoats are coming on bush and on tree, and soon will be scattered on meadow and lea." "Oh, now I understand," said the little rabbit, and he began to laugh. And just then who should come by but Chippy Chipmunk with his pocket full of nuts. I beg your pardon, I mean his cheeks, for that's the way chipmunks carry nuts, you know. They stuff them into their mouths until their cheeks stick out just as if they had the mumps. "Don't look so forlorn because you must travel south," he said to the little wood thrush. "You'll be back again next spring." And then that happy little chipmunk sat down on a log to crack a nut. He wasn't worrying about the cold weather, no siree, and he liked the shady forest when it was crimson and gold, and when Billy Breeze grew rough and tumbled the nuts down from the branches. And if there weren't enough nuts, why, that wise little chipmunk would skip into the cornfields and fill his pockets full of corn. He liked the autumn best of all, for that's when the nuts began to fall. End of chapter 23, read by Brize Cries, Ohio. Chapter 24 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Turnip tea and lettuce cake. Said Turkey Tim one morning, "It seems so strange to me, the farmer is so very kind and generous as can be. He gives me such good things to eat, and chestnuts that are nice and sweet. I wonder why he is so good and gives me such a lot of food." "Don't ask foolish questions. Take what you get and be thankful," said the old gander, who was a dreadfully cross sort of a person anyway, and hissed every time he was provoked. "I could tell them why they are having such fine things to eat," thought Little Jack Rabbit, who just then hopped by the old farmyard. But he didn't. Perhaps he didn't want to make Turkey Tim feel badly. And I wonder if you can guess why. Well, I'll tell you anyway. The farmer was fattening the turkey and the old gander for Thanksgiving. Well, just as the little rabbit was going to hop away, old Sickum, the farmer's dog, came out of his little doghouse and said, "How, how, bow, wow." "I'm very well," said Little Jack Rabbit. "I love these cool November days. You see, my little fur coat keeps me warm. I don't have to cuddle up in the mud on the bottom of the old duck pond the way Granddaddy Bullfrog does for fear he'll get lumbago." And then the little rabbit hopped away across the sunny meadow until he came to the old brush heap where Cousin Cottontail lived. She had moved back there for the winter, as it was near the peach orchard, and she and her little bunnies loved the tender bark of the peach tree. "Good morning, Cousin Cottontail," shouted the little bunny. "Mother wants you to come over this afternoon to have turnip tea and lettuce cake with her." "Now let me think," said the lady rabbit, and she scratched her left ear with her right hind foot. "I'm going down to the 3-1-cent store to buy a potato masher and a can opener. Yes, tell your mother I'll stop in on my way home. And if she has any potatoes she wants mashed, I'll mash them for her, and maybe I'll drink a little turnip tea and tell her the news." Well, after that, Little Jack Rabbit hopped away, and after a while, not so very long, he saw Professor Jim Crow with his little wisdom book under his wing. "Hello there, little rabbit," he said with a loud caw. "Don't be in a hurry. I've something to read to you." And when he had taken his spectacles out of his vest pocket and put them on his beak, he turned to page 23. "I haven't time to wait," said the little bunny. "I must stop on my way home at the old farmyard. Mother wants an egg." End of chapter 24, read by Brize Cries, Ohio.
Chapter 25 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. A Hans Brinker Rabbit. "Here he comes," sang the weathercock on the big red barn as Little Jack Rabbit hopped out of the last story into this one. Then all the barnyard folk came out of the shed where they had been talking to Mrs. Cow and said, "Hello, Little Rabbit, why do you miss the habit of calling on us every day to hear what we may have to say? Now, wasn't that a pretty way to talk? Well, I think so, for it rhymes, don't you know, even if my typewriter did make a mistake and forget to put it into verse." Just then, all of a sudden, Sickum, the old watchdog, saw the little rabbit, and forgetting all about his rheumatism and his one tooth, started after him. But, oh dear me, he couldn't run any faster than an old buggy with 3 wheels and a broken whip, and of course the little rabbit was out of sight before Sickum had crawled through the old rail fence. "Ha, ha!" laughed Professor Jim Crow from the top of the old pine tree. "Don't you know, Sickum, that you can't run as fast as a one-legged beggar man?" And then the old crow gentleman laughed some more, which made Sickum dreadfully angry. But of course that didn't do any good, for it never does any good to get angry anyway, even if nobody laughs at you. So the old watchdog went home and gnawed a bone and then went to sleep. "I'm sure I don't know what to do," sighed the little rabbit as Professor Jim Crow flew away. "There's very little to do in the winter time. I wish it were spring." And then he hopped over to the old duck pond. The ice was smooth and shiny, just as shiny as the plate glass window in the 3-1-cent store. So the little rabbit opened his knapsack and took out his ice skates, and then he went off over the pond as gracefully as Hans Brinker on his silver skates. And when the little rabbit reached the old mill, he looked inside to see if there were any corn left, because he was hungry, for rabbits are always hungry, I believe, just like little boys and girls. But I guess the miller's boy had swept up everything, for there was nothing on the floor but an old iron nail. So the little rabbit hopped away, and by he came to the woody hill where Danny Fox had his home. Now, don't get worried, for that dreadful old fox was away on a visit, and so was Mrs. Fox. Only Slyboots and Bushytail, their 2 little sons, were at home, and little Jack Rabbit wasn't afraid of them. Oh my, no, they were too young to know much about hunting, and little Jack Rabbit knew too much to be caught by a baby fox, let me tell you. "Helloa," said the little bunny when the 2 little foxes looked out of their den. "Where is Daddy Fox?" "He's not home," said Slyboots. "How's Mommy Fox?" asked the little Jack Rabbit. But before the little fox could answer, Bobby Redvest sang the little song you'll find at the top of the next page. Now, I suppose you are wondering why I didn't let this dear little bird sing his song on this page. Well, I'll tell you. He flew over to the next page before I could catch him. That's why. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. The Fox's Den. Oh, Danny Fox is away from home, and so is his wife, Mrs. Fox. Only Slyboots and Bushytail are home in the den in the rocks. Mother's away visiting, replied Bushytail, who couldn't answer in the story before this, you remember, because Bobby Redvest printed the answer in this one. Well, I'm glad to hear that, said Little Jack Rabbit. Don't think I'm impolite. And the little bunny wiggled his nose so fast that the 2 little foxes had to close their eyes. It made them so dizzy. Why, his little pink nose winkled and twinkled 3 times and a half as often as the twinkle, twinkle star does on a cold, frosty night. Don't you dare go out of the house when your father and mother are away? Asked the little rabbit. No, Mother told us to stay inside, and Daddy told us not to go outside. So what can we do? Answered the 2 little foxes, and they looked wistfully over the snow-covered meadow. And oh my, didn't they wish they could go out for a nice run. Well, do as you are told, cautioned the little rabbit, and he hopped away till he came to the kind farmer's peach orchard. Now, you know, there is nothing so nice to a little rabbit as the tender bark of a young peach tree, and at once the little bunny began to eat the bark of the nearest tree, and pretty soon there wouldn't have been any peaches on that tree when the summer came if the farmer himself hadn't come by with a load of wood. And when he saw what was going on, he jumped off the big sled without even saying "whoa" to the horses, and picked up a piece of ice and threw it at Little Jack Rabbit. And if the little bunny had only kept still, he would have been hit right on his left ear. But he didn't, you see. He hopped to one side and then away to the shady forest, and all the kind farmer could do was to wind some old rags around the peach tree and go home with his load of wood. Dear me, thought Little Jack Rabbit, everybody is after me. I can't even show myself but what somebody tries to catch me, and if I stop to eat anything I have things thrown at me. And then he sat down and opened his knapsack and took out a carrot cake and a lollipop, for he was so hungry that he could have eaten a snowball if it had been covered with only a little chocolate syrup. And while he sat there, a little snowbird sang this song. When the winter comes, you know, all the earth is clad in snow, and the stars go winky-blink with snowflakes in their eyes, I think. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. A Lucky Escape. Now, as soon as Little Jack Rabbit had finished all the good things in his knapsack, he felt hungry all over again. Goodness me! What was he to do? He didn't know himself, so he began to whistle a tune, and I think the words to it went like this. Carrot cake is good to eat, and lettuce leaves are crisp and sweet, but now that snow is on the ground, no clover flowers can be found, but in our bramble patch we've stored for winter use a goodly hoard. Let me tell you something out of my wisdom book, said Professor Jim Crow, and he flew down from his pine tree house, and opening his book at page 1, 2, 3, began to read. Save a penny every day, then when you are old and gray, you'll not want for things to eat when rheumatism's in your feet. Why didn't you tell me that long ago? Shouted a voice all of a sudden, just like that, and there stood Danny Fox with a crutch under his right foreleg. Oh dear, said the little rabbit under his breath. I hope Danny Fox is too lame to catch me. And maybe that old fox heard him, for he said, Don't be worried, little bunny. I'll not rob you of your money. Well, I haven't got any money with me, said the little rabbit. I spent it all yesterday buying eggs at the farmyard, but I've got 3 lollipops in my knapsack. And then, oh dear me, what do you suppose happened? That wicked old fox threw away his crutch, and then, oh dear me, what do you suppose happened? That wicked old fox threw away his crutch and ran for the little rabbit. And if Professor Jim Crow hadn't dropped his little wisdom book by mistake because he was so frightened, you know, and hit Danny Fox on the end of his nose, I guess the little bunny would have been caught and maybe eaten up right then and there, and maybe sooner. But when that little wisdom book hit the wicked old fox on the nose, it brought the tears to his eyes, and he couldn't see. And before he could grab Little Jack Rabbit, that nimble little bunny was inside an old hollow stump as safe as you please. "You're a bad fox," said Professor Jim Crow as soon as he was over his fright and had picked up his little wisdom book. "You're an old hypocrite," which means a person who makes believe he's something else, you know, and usually something much nicer. Oh, very much nicer. Oh, my, yes. And this made the old fox feel so ashamed that he ran away to his den in the rocks on the wooded hillside and didn't go out for a week. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Swanson. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Seeing Two Ways. Well, as soon as Danny Fox had left Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Jim Crow in the last story, who should come jumping along but Uncle John Hare. "Ah, my dear friends," he said, sitting down to rest, "I've just had a narrow escape from the miller's dog." Now, Uncle John Hare never would have escaped had it not been that his eyes have the power to see things in the rear. It is a wonderful gift that loving Mother Nature has given him, this power to see behind as well as in front, for in this way Uncle John Hare can keep on running swiftly without turning his head to see how close the enemy is to his long hind legs. And even when he is about to be caught, he can suddenly turn and go the opposite direction so swiftly that he often escapes being caught. And now that you know something about Uncle John Hare, I'll tell you how he came to be chased by the miller's dog. Now, Little Jack Rabbit was more careful about going too near the old mill, for he had been chased several times. But Uncle John Hare, who lived in Turnip City, didn't even know that there was a dog at the old mill. So, as he was hopping along near the old duck pond, out came the miller's dog. Away went Uncle John Hare as fast as he could, but the miller's dog was a fast runner, and pretty soon Uncle John Hare could see that it was only a question of a few minutes when he would be caught. So all of a sudden, just as he reached the bubbling brook, he turned sharply about and made off for the old bramble patch. And, oh dear me, but I'm awfully glad, just the same, that Miller's dog couldn't stop in time, and over the bubbling brook he went. That is, he tried to, but instead he slipped on the opposite bank and fell back into the water. And when he pulled himself out, all dripping wet, Uncle John Hare was safe in the old bramble patch with Little Jack Rabbit. "Mr. Dog, you'd better learn that a little hare can turn, quick as lightning in his track, when you're almost on his back. He can see two ways at once. Mr. Dog, you are a dunce," shouted Little Jack Rabbit as the disappointed miller's dog shook the water from his hairy coat and looked around to see what had become of Uncle John Hare. "You just wait until next time," he growled, as he ran back to the old mill to lie down in the sun to dry. "Well, well,"
cawed Professor Jim Crow when he heard how Uncle John Hare had escaped from the miller's dog. Then he pulled out of his pocket his wisdom book and turned to page 23. The big giraffe, like the little hare, can see both ways, I do declare. They both are timid, and that's why Mother Nature gave each a wonderful eye. The hare can see just when to turn, when the enemy's dangerously close astern. The giraffe can see just how, you know, with his strong hind legs to land a blow. And then that wise professor closed his book and added, "Did you comb your hair this morning, little Jack Rabbit?" Wasn't that a strange thing to ask all of a sudden, just like that? End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Swanson. Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory. Valentines. Of course I did, Professor Crow. Why do you ask? I'd like to know, answered Little Jack Rabbit, just like that, when Professor Jim Crow in the last story asked him if he had combed his hair that morning. Because, whispered that wise old bird, nobody will send you a nice valentine if you don't look neat and trim and smile away like Sunny Jim. Goodness me, said the little rabbit. I almost forgot St. Valentine's Day. And then he hopped away as fast as he could to the 3-1-cent store to buy some valentines. Well, as soon as he got there, the lady salesman, oh dear me, I mean the saleslady, said, "Do you want a comic valentine?" "No, indeed," answered the little bunny. "I want a valentine to send to my dear, kind, generous uncle, Mr. John Hare, who lives in Turnip City, corner of Lettuce Avenue and Carrot Street, USA. Here's just what you want, said the saleslady, who I forgot to tell you was a little yellow hen with a red coral comb on the top of her head. Well, what do you suppose she handed to the little rabbit? You'd never guess, so I'll tell you right away. A big card shaped like a cabbage and painted green, and when you pulled a string, a rabbit's head popped right out of the middle. "I'll take it," shouted Little Jack Rabbit. "But I'd like another one to send to Mother." So the little yellow hen looked all around, and pretty soon she said, "Here's the very thing." And what do you suppose she picked out this time? Well, you'd never guess, so why did I ask you? It was the picture of a lovely lady rabbit, with a pink sunbonnet on her head, and a cabbage bouquet in her right paw, and underneath it said, "To Mother, my first sweetheart." "How did you know I'd like it?" asked Little Jack Rabbit, taking his carrot money out of his pocket. "Never mind," said the little yellow hen. "You send it to your mother, and she'll be as happy can be." Well, just as Little Jack Rabbit was posting them in the corner letter box, who should come along but Danny Fox with his 2 small sons, Bushytail and Slyboots. But the little bunny wasn't afraid, for just across the street was the policeman dog with his big club. So the little rabbit said, "Hello, Danny Fox. St. Valentine's is almost here. Do you know that?" "Gracious me, I mustn't forget the big fat hen at the farmyard," said that sly old robber with a grin that showed all his long white teeth. And he went into the 3-1-cent store to buy a valentine. Dear me, is it all over? I feel lonely all of a sudden. But never mind, I have another book for you called Little Jack Rabbit and the Squirrel Brother. The End. End of chapter 29. End of Little Jack Rabbit and Professor Crow by David Cory.